In the final chaotic months of World War II, German soldiers faced a terrible choice: surrender to the advancing Soviets in the East, or to the Americans and British in the West. The difference often meant life or death. To the East, rumors spread of brutal reprisals, starvation, and forced marches into the unknown. To the West, surrender promised food, shelter, and, most importantly, a chance at survival. Entire divisions abandoned their posts, marching toward American lines with hands raised high, desperate to escape the wrath of the Red Army. This was not just surrender, it was a race for survival. The spring of 1945 was unlike any other time in history. The Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. Cities lay in ruins. German civilians were fleeing for their lives. And what was once considered the most disciplined fighting force in Europe, the Wehrmacht, was now little more than scattered remnants trying to survive. To the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly. Soviet tanks rolled across Poland, East Prussia, and into the very heart of Germany itself. Stories spread like wildfire among German troops, of Soviet vengeance, of entire villages burned, of mass executions and starvation in prison camps. Some tales were exaggerated, some brutally true. But to the average German soldier, the thought of surrendering to the Soviets was unthinkable. It was a path that promised misery, humiliation, and very likely death. To the west, however, stood the Americans and British. Their bombs had reduced cities to rubble, yes, but soldiers who had already been captured whispered something shocking in American camps. Prisoners were fed. They were given blankets. Some even received cigarettes and medical care. Compared to the horrors expected in the East, surrendering to the Americans seemed like salvation. By April 1945, entire units of German soldiers were no longer fighting to defend the Reich. They were fighting to reach the American lines before the Soviets caught them. Desperation drove them westward, sometimes abandoning weapons, sometimes marching openly in uniform with their hands raised high. To be captured by the Americans was no longer shameful. It was a lifeline. One such scene unfolded near the Elbe River. German forces, once sworn to fight to the last man, now streamed across fields and roads. Officers tore the insignia from their uniforms, while younger boys and old men, pressed into service by Hitler's desperate call for a people's army, dropped their rifles in ditches. American soldiers on patrol watched in astonishment as dozens, then hundreds of Germans approached them, arms in the air, shouting the only English words they knew: "No Russia! America!" America. In some cases, German officers even begged the Americans to accept entire regiments. They knew the Soviets were only days away, and capture by the Red Army meant a march to the gulags of Siberia. The Americans, overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners, sometimes had no choice but to disarm them quickly, hand out rations, and herd them into makeshift camps. Prisoners who had once been proud and feared soldiers were suddenly thankful for the simplest of things: a tin of canned meat, a piece of bread, a cigarette. Many later wrote in diaries or memoirs that the Americans treated them more humanely than they could ever have imagined. The contrast was shocking. Only weeks earlier, they had fought against these men with deadly ferocity. Now, they viewed them not as enemies, but as liberators from their own fate. Yet the desperation was not only about survival, it was also about time. Every day, Soviet forces closed the gap. In places like Czechoslovakia and Eastern Germany, German soldiers risked their lives to desert and march west. Families joined them, women and children trailing behind columns of broken soldiers, praying that the first uniform they saw belonged to an American, not a Soviet. One American private later recalled the sheer disbelief he felt. Instead of bloody firefights, his unit found itself suddenly responsible for processing thousands of surrendering troops. It was like a flood, he said. They came in lines, hands up, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. They were terrified of the Russians, and to them, we were their only hope. For the Germans, there was also the bitter reality that their leaders had abandoned them. Hitler's fanatical orders to fight to the last were no longer obeyed. Soldiers saw no reason to die for a regime that had already collapsed. To them, surrender was not betrayal. It was common sense. Some even believed that if they lived through this war, they could rebuild their lives when the madness finally ended. The scenes repeated themselves all across Germany in those final weeks. Bridges, forests, and open fields became crowded with soldiers throwing away rifles, ripping swastikas from their uniforms, and approaching American lines in groups that grew larger by the day. In some cases, American commanders were stunned to realize they had more prisoners than their own fighting men. And so, in the dying days of the Third Reich, the desperation of German troops told a greater truth, that loyalty to Hitler and his empire had evaporated. What mattered now was survival, a warm meal, and the faint chance of a future. Surrender was no longer shame, it was salvation. When the war finally ended in May 1945, millions of German soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire in American and British camps. Yet for many, this was a relief. They had escaped the Red Army, escaped execution, and escaped starvation. For them, captivity was not the end. It was the beginning of survival. The image of German troops rushing to surrender to Americans remains one of the most telling symbols of the war's final chapter. It was the moment when the mighty Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, became a beaten army of desperate men, racing not to victory, but to the safety of their enemies. And in that desperation, history saw something extraordinary. Men who once fought for conquest now fought only for mercy. May 4, 1945. Damaged Tangamunda Bridge, Elbe River, the last crossing. Shattered steel beams groaned under the weight of thousands as German soldiers navigated the twisted remains of what had once been a modern crossing. The bridge, destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces on April 12, now served as a precarious lifeline, a single-file pathway of broken concrete and bent metal spanning the Elbe. Signal intercepted by American intelligence. 107th Infantry Division sector. Wehrmacht units abandoning all positions. Mass movement detected toward American lines. Estimated 100,000 military personnel and civilians attempting westward escape through destroyed infrastructure. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry Regiment lowered his field glasses and studied the endless column of humanity streaming across the wrecked bridge. American forces had reached the Elbe 2 weeks earlier, establishing their positions according to agreements made at Yoltar. What none of the Allied planners had anticipated was that this damaged river crossing would become the focal point of the largest voluntary military surrender in Western history. The urgency driving German forces revealed a calculation more fundamental than military strategy: the statistical certainty of death in Soviet captivity versus survival in American hands. Intelligence reports flooding HA headquarters painted an extraordinary picture. German forces weren't simply retreating. They were abandoning defensive positions, destroying their own equipment when it slowed their movement, and fighting through SS blocking detachments that tried to stop them. The Wehrmacht, once Europe's most disciplined military machine, was dissolving into a human flood flowing toward one objective: American lines on the western bank of the Elbe River. The calculation of survival had become brutally clear by late April 1945. German military intelligence had intercepted Soviet communications, revealing projected casualty rates for Wehrmacht prisoners. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, statistical projections suggested fewer than 40 would survive to return home. The actual numbers would prove even more catastrophic. The strategic situation was beyond recovery. 8 million German civilians were fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Behind them, Marshal Gyeorgyi Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Khan's First Ukrainian Front were crushing the last organized German resistance with overwhelming superiority. 20 Soviet divisions for every German division still combat effective. The Soviet advance was covering 30 kilometers daily. Refugee columns managed 10 kilometers on good days. The outcome was inevitable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment, captured after Germany's surrender, contained a single, underlined directive: maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism, but recognition of a fundamental reality. Surrender to Americans meant probable survival, while capture by Soviets meant probable death. The Yalta Agreement had already determined occupation zones, but German commanders were gambling on a single observation. American forces had halted at the Elbe River as agreed with their Soviet allies. If German units could cross that river before Soviet forces arrived from the east, they would enter American custody. The race wasn't for victory or negotiated peace, but for the basic human possibility of surviving captivity. American forces holding the western bank of the Elbe possessed overwhelming logistical superiority that would prove crucial in processing the coming surge. Each infantry division had attached military police battalions, field kitchens capable of feeding 15,000 men daily, mobile medical units with surgical capabilities, and vast supply stockpiles reflecting American industrial capacity. Major James Morrison, operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division, had studied mass surrender logistics after the Ruhr Pocket operation in mid-April where 325 Zauser Germans had surrendered. His calculations were sobering. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening for typhus and dysentery delousing stations, and administrative documentation generating 12 forms per individual. The Geneva Convention mandated specific caloric intakes, 800 calories for working prisoners, 2 Zalosen for non-working. These weren't just numbers, but the difference between order and chaos when handling desperate humanity. German forces approaching the Elbe represented the full spectrum of Wehrmacht dissolution. Elite Waffen-SS units still possessed operational Tiger tanks and sophisticated communications. Regular army divisions had been reduced to battalion strength, carrying only personal weapons. Volcrum units, boys as young as 14 and men over 60, possessed only armbands and obsolete rifles from World War I. Behind them came auxiliary services, Organisation Taut construction battalions, Luftwaffe ground crews without aircraft, Kriegsmarine personnel from destroyed ports, and female auxiliary staff who faced particular horrors if captured by Soviet forces. Intelligence analysis placed German forces east of the Elbe at approximately 1.2 million as of April 25, 1945. Of these, 300 Zauden were in organized combat units, 400 Zausen were support personnel, and 500 Zausen were scattered Wehrmacht and Volkssturm members already fleeing westward. The critical factor was movement rate. Soviet mechanized spearheads could advance 50 kilobers daily. German units on foot managed 30 kilobers under optimal conditions. The window for escape was measured in hours. The first major indicator came on April 20, 1945, when General Walter Wenck received Hitler's order to attack toward Berlin with his 12th Army. Instead, Wenck made a fateful decision that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Rather than waste his forces in a futile assault on the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, he would use his army to hold open an escape corridor to the American lines. At his headquarters near Belelig, Wenck gathered his commanders. "Comrades," he announced, "the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living, our soldiers and the civilians depending on us. We attack but westward to open a path to the Americans." This wasn't cowardice, but calculated humanity. Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Rachelm, had compiled devastating statistics from Soviet-occupied territories. In East Prussia alone, an estimated 300,000 civilians had died during the Soviet advance from combat exposure, revenge killings, and mass rape. Applied to the populations now trapped between the Elbe and advancing Soviet forces, these ratios meant potential casualties in the millions. By April 24th, forward American observation posts reported extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approached the Ila without tactical spacing, headlights blazing in violation of basic combat principles. Wehrmacht units arrived in parade formation, their officers maintaining military bearing even in defeat. These weren't beaten rabbles, but organized forces choosing captivity over continued resistance. Captain Robert Thornton, commanding a reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armored Division, radioed division headquarters. "German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They're displaying white flags and requesting terms." Within hours, the trickle became a flood. The U.S. 9th Army processed 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th, 7,000 on April 25th, and 15,000 on April 26th. These weren't combat captures, but deliberate surrenders by units still possessing ammunition and fighting capability. The Ruhr Pocket surrender earlier in April had established the precedent. When Field Marshal Walter Maud dissolved Army Group B, rather than formally surrender, 325 Zalausen German troops had given themselves up to American forces. The treatment they received, food, medical care, protection from revenge, seeking displaced persons, spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Radio intercepts by American signals. Intelligence revealed remarkable conversations between German units. On April 27th, The commander of 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted, Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed. That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Units that had fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching American lines. Sergeant Wilhelm Becke of the 21st Panzer Division later testified, "Wyatt heard the Americans fed prisoners, provided medical care, didn't shoot the wounded. After years of total war, such humanity seemed impossible. Yet we raced toward it. But reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet. SS blocking detachments had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization. Military police units established checkpoints on all Western roads, turning back or shooting defeatists attempting to flee. The SS remained fanatically loyal, even as the Reich collapsed around them, viewing surrender as betrayal rather than survival. The Battle of Halbe from April 24 to May 1 represented the bloodiest example of the eastward flight's human cost. General Theodor Buss's 9th Army encircled southeast of Berlin comprised 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians. Hitler ordered them to fight toward Berlin and link up with the capital's defenders. Instead, Buah coordinated with Wank to break out westward toward American lines. The breakout began at 2000 hours on April 25. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their last fuel reserves to punch through Soviet lines near Halbe village. Behind them came an extraordinary procession. Combat troops, medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The column stretched 30 kilometers through the Spree forest, a serpentine mass of humanity stumbling through swamps and woods. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Kusha rocket batteries fired into packed columns. Iltermovik aircraft strafed anything moving. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled up at stream crossings where Soviet machine guns had perfect fields of fire. Wounded soldiers who couldn't keep up were abandoned where they fell. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, described the horror. No longer war but massacre. Soviet artillery turned forest paths into death zones. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics were catastrophic. Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wank's lines in eventual American captivity. The Halbe Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. Another 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces, few of whom would survive captivity. The remainder simply vanished, killed in unnamed skirmishes, drowned attempting river crossings, or lost in the forest depths. General Wank's 12th Army performed one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian operations. Defying Hitler's direct orders to attack toward Berlin, Wen instead established a 40-kilometer corridor from the Ila River to the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His 100,000 troops, including the elite Clausewitz and Scharnhorst divisions, held this passage against Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through. The general established his headquarters in a schoolhouse near Furch, transforming it into a coordination center for the evacuation. His staff worked around the clock, organizing transportation for wounded, distributing the army's last food supplies to civilians, and maintaining radio contact with scattered German units still fighting their way west. Lieutenant Hans Mayman, serving in Wank's operations section, recorded the magnitude of their task. We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector, plus remnants of 20 different military units. No food for civilians, medical supplies exhausted, ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of combat. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach American lines. Wank personally visited forward positions, encouraging exhausted soldiers to hold their positions just a few more days. To his men, many of them teenagers from training schools or elderly Volkram, he became a figure of almost mythical determination. He could have fled, one soldier later recalled. Senior officers were disappearing daily, heading west in staff cars, but Wen stayed. And because he stayed, we stayed. The general's tactical brilliance showed in his defensive positioning. Rather than attempting to hold a continuous line, He established strong points at key road junctions and river crossings, forcing Soviet units to deploy for formal attacks rather than simply pursuing. This bought precious time for the refugee columns, though at terrible cost to the defending units. The damaged Tangamunda Bridge became the focal point of the evacuation. Wehrmacht engineers had blown the modern structure on April 12 to slow the American advance, but ironically its twisted remains now served as the only crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. German military engineers and American combat engineers worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. The scenes at the crossing defied military precedent. From May 4th to May 7th, an estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach while American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood that chaos would mean disaster. If the crossing became blocked, thousands would be trapped as Soviet forces approached. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 107th Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked our engineers for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless and heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with a complete regimental staff and insisted on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag. An SS general appeared in full dress uniform, requesting honorable captivity for his men. A naval captain led 200 Marine sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, having been pressed into ground combat. Female auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east. Most poignant were the civilians. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages and wheelbarrows. Children separated from parents in the chaos were passed hand-to-hand across the bridge. Elderly people who could barely walk were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in their beds, were wheeled across by medical staff who had refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the western approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight. Soldiers still carrying weapons they'd stack in piles like cordwood. Women with babies. Kids who looked like they should be in grammar school but wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Old men in Volker armbands. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted. They were just grateful to reach our side. The sheer scale overwhelmed American administrative capacity. Geneva Convention requirements mandated specific documentation for each prisoner, medical screening, and provision of adequate food and shelter. Processing one prisoner properly required 20 minutes. At peak flow, 20,000 were arriving daily. The system simply collapsed under the weight of numbers. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the 18th Airborne Corps, made a crucial decision. Forget the paperwork. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get medical attention to the wounded. Documentation can wait. Lives can't. This pragmatic approach saved thousands but created administrative chaos lasting years. Families were separated in the confusion, some never to reunite. Soldiers were separated from their units, making accurate casualty counts impossible. War criminals potentially escaped justice in the mass of humanity. But the alternative, turning people away, was unthinkable. The medical crisis was acute. Army medical units estimated 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate attention. Malnutrition was universal after months on starvation rations. Typhus spread by lice threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds untreated for weeks had become gangrenous. Battlefield surgery units designed to treat dozens were handling hundreds daily. Captain David Miller, medical officer with the 330 Medical Battalion, performed surgery for 72 straight hours. These weren't fresh combat wounds. These were weeks old, infected untreated. Men had been walking on broken bones, fighting with shrapnel still embedded. Women auxiliaries with untreated injuries from assault. Children with malnutrition so severe they couldn't stand. The supply situation strained even American abundance. A single infantry division carried rations for 15,000 men for 7 days. By May 5th, they were feeding 60,000 prisoners plus uncounted civilians. Emergency convoys ran continuously from rear depots. C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies by parachute. The Red Ball Express, which had supplied Patton's race across France, was reactivated to feed surrendered enemies. At SHA headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. The Yalta agreements were explicit. German forces must surrender to all allies simultaneously. Separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight Soviets violated inter-allied agreements. Yet the humanitarian catastrophe was undeniable. On May 4th, Admiral Karl Donitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state, sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg to negotiate with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Friedberg's proposal was frank: immediate surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and Holland to Western allies, allowing maximum evacuation from the east. Montgomery, bound by Allied agreements, could only accept unconditional surrender to all allies, but he also understood the human dimension. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The Germans weren't just seeking military surrender. They were seeking salvation from Soviet retribution. As soldiers, we could offer honorable captivity. What the Russians offered, God only knows. The temporary solution was pragmatic. German forces reaching American lines, before the formal surrender on May 8th, would be processed as prisoners. Those arriving after would be subject to repatriation agreements with Soviets. This created a deadly deadline. Cross the Elbe before midnight on May 8th or face Soviet captivity." General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, later testified, "Knew what we were doing. We were accepting surrenders we technically shouldn't have, processing enemies still fighting our allies. But we also knew what Soviet captivity meant. Sometimes humanity trumps protocol. The period from May 4th to May 8th witnessed scenes of extraordinary urgency. Knowing formal surrender was imminent, German units abandoned all pretense of military order. Soldiers threw away equipment to move faster. Officers burned documents rather than slow their retreat. Entire divisions dissolved as men made individual decisions to flee west. The damaged Tanga-Munda crossing operated continuously. Even after Soviet forces reached artillery range on May 6th, the stream of refugees continued. American officers ordered their artillery to provide counter-fire, technically engaging Soviet forces to protect Germans crossing to surrender. It was one of the war's strangest moments. Americans and Germans cooperating while still officially at war. At 041 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Remes. The ceasefire would take effect at 2:31 hours on May 8th. This gave German forces exactly 45 hours to reach American lines. The greatest race against time in military history had begun. What followed defied military categorization. This wasn't retreat or surrender, but human migration under arms. Intelligence estimated 250,000 German military personnel remained east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within 45 hours, approximately 180,000 would successfully reach American lines. The others would enter Soviet captivity with terrible consequences. General Venk's final operation exemplified military honor in defeat. His 12th Army held its corridor until the last possible moment, allowing remnants of the 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians to escape. Wenck positioned his last operational tanks and artillery to hold Soviet forces while the exodus continued. At 1:00 hours on May 7th, Wen issued his final order. "The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men." It was not a surrender but a release from duty, allowing his soldiers to make their own choices. Wen himself was among the last to cross at 0200 hours on May 8th, walking across a damaged railroad bridge near Tanga-Munda less than 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tanks were already entering positions his men had abandoned hours earlier. Of his original 200,000 men, approximately 100,000 reached American lines. An estimated 250,000 civilians were saved by his defiance of Hitler's orders. Individual stories revealed the depth of desperation. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann flew his Mess's Bf-109 west until fuel ran out, crash landing in an American-occupied field rather than risk Soviet territory. U-boat commander Heinrich Lehmann-Wilhelm Brock sailed his submarine up the Elbe as far as possible, then scuttled it and led his crew overland to American lines. A Wehrmacht doctor stayed with severely wounded patients who couldn't be moved, knowing it meant Soviet captivity, saying only, "Someone must care for those who cannot flee." A teenage soldier gave his place on an overcrowded truck to an elderly civilian, then began walking the 100 kilometers to American lines. He arrived 18 hours after the ceasefire, technically too late, but was accepted by sympathetic American guards. The Rhein Meadow camps became collection points for this human flood. These temporary enclosures, often just agricultural fields surrounded by barbed wire, held over 1 million German prisoners by May 15th. Conditions were harsh but survivable. The crucial difference from Soviet camps. Prisoners initially had no shelter except holes dug in the ground. Food was basic 200 calories daily initially, increased as supplies improved. Water came from rivers and temporary pipes. Sanitation was primitive. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded conditions, yet the death rate remained below 1% compared to 35% or higher in Soviet camps. Colonel James Foster, commanding Camp Remagen, faced extraordinary challenges. Designed for 100,000, it held 184,000 by May 12th. We had SS generals next to communist prisoners, Hitler Youth teenagers beside Stalingrad veterans, female auxiliaries requiring separate facilities, naval personnel who'd never seen ground combat. It was controlled chaos, but we maintained order and kept them alive. The processing revealed complete Wehrmacht collapse. Some units arrived with complete documentation enabling accurate recording. Others had no identification beyond remembered names. The once mighty 16th Panzer Division arrived with 312 men from an authorized strength of 14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division consisted of 89 elderly men. Classification proved impossible. Were Hitler Youth members soldiers or children? Were female auxiliaries military personnel or civilians? Were FOCAM combatants or press civilians? American authorities generally chose humanitarian interpretation, processing all as prisoners of war, entitled to Geneva Convention protection. What German forces fled became clear as Soviet-occupied territories revealed their grim reality. NKVD documents declassified after 1991 confirmed German fears were justified. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, at least 1.1 million died in captivity. The death rate in 1945 to 1946 exceeded 50% in many camps. Causes were multiple and interconnected. Soviet logistics could barely supply their own forces, let alone millions of prisoners. German prisoners received 600 to 800 calories daily, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Siberian winter temperatures dropped to 40 degrees C without adequate clothing or shelter. Beyond material deprivation was systematic brutality. Soviet guards, many having lost families to German atrocities, showed little mercy. Prisoners worked in uranium mines without protection, in logging camps with impossible quotas on construction projects where safety was ignored. The wounded and sick were often shot as useless mouths. Former Soviet officer Victor Estaff later wrote, "We were told every dead German was payment for our suffering. Payment for Leningrad, Stalingrad, for 27 million Soviet dead." Guards competed to see who could work prisoners to death fastest. To show mercy was to betray our fallen comrades. The statistics told the entire story. American records show that of 3.8 million German prisoners in Western custody, approximately 137,000 died, a death rate of 3.6%. Most deaths occurred from wounds received before capture or disease in the war's chaotic final weeks. By June 1945, the death rate in American camps had stabilized at 0.15% monthly. Soviet records, even official ones, reveal catastrophe. Soviet figures acknowledge 356,700 German prisoner deaths, but German research indicates the true number exceeded 1 million. The Mashka Commission documented that of prisoners taken in 1945, fewer than 50% survived to 1950. The differential was starker for specific groups. Waffen-SS members had a 20% survival rate in Soviet camps versus 95% in American custody. Female auxiliaries faced systematic assault in Soviet custody, while Americans generally released them within months. Hitler Youth teenagers were often executed immediately by Soviet forces as fascist fanatics, while Americans processed them as juvenile prisoners, requiring rehabilitation rather than punishment. The mass surrender to American forces in 1945 had profound consequences for post-war Europe. American and British forces controlled the majority of surviving German military personnel, providing crucial intelligence advantages as the Cold War began. Operation Paperclip succeeded partly because technical personnel had deliberately surrendered to Americans. Baron Braun's rocket team traveled 500 kilometers through collapsing German lines specifically to reach American forces. We despise the French, fear the Soviets, Don't believe the British can afford us. That leaves the Americans, Von Braun told colleagues. His decision would eventually put Americans on the moon. The demographic impact was equally significant. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania lost virtually their entire male population of military age, killed in combat, fled west, or disappeared in Soviet captivity. Entire family lines were extinguished. The German Democratic Republic would struggle for decades with gender imbalance created by the loss of so many men. The psychological impact lasted generations. Families divided by the inner German border often traced their separation to those desperate days in May 1945. Some members reaching American lines, others trapped in Soviet occupation zones. The arbitrary nature of survival determined by which army captured you became a defining trauma of German post-war experience. By 2:31 hours on May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners in the war's final 3 weeks. The 100th Infantry Division alone accepted surrender of 313,000 enemies, more than the entire German army that invaded Poland in 1939. The final totals staggered contemporary observers. The U.S. Ninth Army reported 423,000 prisoners between April 20th and May 8th. The First Army processed 387,000. Analysis showed fewer than 20,000 were taken in actual combat. The rest surrendered voluntarily, often fighting through their own lines to do so. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "We prepared for victory, not for this." The German army didn't just surrender, it dissolved. Men who'd fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching our lines. They knew what we learned later. Surrender to us meant life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death. The numbers continued growing even after the ceasefire. Between May 8th and May 31st, another 874,000 German military personnel managed to reach Western Allied lines from Soviet-controlled areas, either through escape, administrative confusion, or sympathetic interpretation of deadlines by American and British forces. Individual stories revealed the human dimension behind statistics. Corporal Friedrich Miller, who surrendered at Tangamunda on May 5th, kept a diary throughout captivity. First day without fear in 6 years. Americans gave us bread. Real bread, not sawdust. Guard offered cigarette. I cried. After what we did, why do they treat us as humans? Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a military hospital unit. We had 300 wounded. Americans took them all, even SS men. American doctors operated through the night, saving German soldiers. One told me, "The war's over. Now we're just doctors and you're just patients." I couldn't believe such mercy existed. Wehrmacht Private Hans Bauer, age 17, later testified, "I'd been told Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor. Instead, they gave me chocolate. I hadn't seen chocolate in 3 years. A medic treated my infected wound. An officer asked if I could contact my mother. They treated me not as an enemy, but as a boy who'd been forced to fight." Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung, who expected execution, instead received medical treatment for wounds and eventual release. I deserved no mercy. My unit had committed terrible acts. Yet Americans treated me according to law and not revenge. That mercy haunted me more than any punishment could have. General Welter Wen survived the war, living until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on those desperate days. "I disobeyed Hitler's orders and would do so again. My duty wasn't to a dead ideology, but to living men under my command. Every soldier we got across the Elbe was a victory. Every civilian saved was a triumph. We lost the war, but in those last days, we saved what could be saved, human lives." Wen never expressed regret for his defiance. Hitler ordered us to sacrifice ourselves for his gut-Dämmerung fantasy. I chose instead to save my men for their families, for Germany's future. Between honor and humanity, I chose humanity. History can judge whether I was right. His actions saved an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet captivity. Many survivors and their descendants still gather annually on May 8th to honor Wenck's memory, calling him the general who chose life over death. Mercy over ideology. The mass German surrender to American forces in April-May 1945 represented more than military capitulation. It was a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a testament to mercy's power in warfare's darkest hour. The event challenged traditional narratives. German forces didn't simply stop fighting when ordered. They actively sought American captivity as salvation. The disciplined Wehrmacht of 1940 had become a desperate mass by 1945, willing to risk everything to avoid Soviet retribution. For American forces, the experience proved transformative. Young soldiers who'd fought across Europe suddenly found themselves saving enemies who days before had been trying to kill them. The professional handling of this crisis, despite overwhelming numbers and logistical challenges, demonstrated American organizational capability and fundamental humanity. Military historian John Keegan later wrote, "The German flight to American lines in 1945 was unprecedented. Never before had such numbers deliberately sought specific captivity, while still capable of resistance. It demonstrated that even in total war, human calculations of mercy versus revenge could override ideology and orders." The last German soldier to cross at Tangamunda was folk member Hinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 22:47 hours on May 8, 1945, exactly 14 minutes before the ceasefire. When asked why he'd risked everything to cross, he simply said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did. Millions who failed to reach American lines did not. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, who helped process surrendering Germans, provided perhaps the most profound observation. They weren't really surrendering to us. They were fleeing from something worse. We just happened to represent survival. Any one of us might have done the same in their position. The desperate German flight to American lines in 1945 revealed fundamental truths about warfare and human nature. Even in humanity's darkest conflict, the difference between mercy and revenge, between life and death, could be measured in the simple question of which uniform received your surrender. For millions of Germans in April and May 1945, that difference was everything. The choice between American and Soviet captivity wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about survival itself. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Surrender to Americans meant probable life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death. The final accounting was stark. Of Germans who surrendered to Western allies, 96.4% survived captivity. Of Germans captured by Soviets, fewer than 65% returned home. Behind these percentages lay individual tragedies and triumphs that would shape families, communities, and nations for generations. But beyond statistics lay a deeper truth. The American response to this crisis, feeding enemies, treating wounded, maintaining order despite overwhelming numbers, demonstrated that even in total war's aftermath, humanity could prevail over vengeance. Young American soldiers, many having lost friends to German weapons, chose duty and decency over revenge. The damaged crossing at Tangamunda became more than a bridge over the Elbe. It was a passage between life and death, between mercy and retribution, between the Western and Soviet interpretations of victory. Those who crossed it before May 8, 1945, generally survived to rebuild their lives and country. Those who didn't faced years of suffering in Soviet camps, if they survived at all. The mass surrender also demonstrated war's ultimate irony. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the war as conquerors seeking Laban's realm in the east, ended it as refugees fleeing westward. The master race ideology collapsed into desperate individuals seeking only survival. The 1,000-year reich lasted 12 years, ending with its soldiers racing to surrender to armies they'd once dismissed as decadent democracies. For historians, the event raises profound questions. Was American acceptance of these surrenders a humanitarian triumph or a violation of interallied agreements? Did saving German soldiers from Soviet captivity serve justice or subvert it? The answers remain debated, but the human impact was undeniable. The legacy echoes still. German-American relations in the post-war period were profoundly influenced by this mercy. West Germany's integration into NATO, its development as a democratic state, its role as America's key European ally during the Cold War. All were influenced by the memory of American humanity and victory. The last crossing of the Elbe was not merely the end of a war. It was the largest gamble on human mercy in military history, a desperate bet by defeated enemies that their conquerors would choose humanity over vengeance. For those who made it across, it was a gamble that paid off with the only currency that ultimately mattered: their lives, and through them the future of a nation that would rise from the ashes to become a cornerstone of European democracy. The damaged bridge at Tangamunda, where so many crossed from death to life, was never rebuilt, but its memory endures as a monument to one of warfare's fundamental truths. In the end, The measure of victory is not in enemies destroyed, but in lives saved, not in vengeance taken, but in mercy shown. That is the final lesson of the German flight to American lines in 1945. That even in history's most devastating conflict, humanity could prevail over hatred, mercy could triumph over revenge, and life could be chosen over death. For the hundreds of thousands who crossed the Elbe in those desperate days, that choice made all the difference. Their crossing was not just an escape from Soviet retribution. It was a passage from the old world of total war and racial hatred to the possibility of a new world built on law, mercy, and human dignity. That so many risk everything to reach American lines was not just a military phenomenon, but a profound human testament to the power of mercy in victory. The story ends where it began, at a damaged bridge over the Elbe where desperate enemies became grateful prisoners, where American soldiers became unlikely saviors, and where the simple act of accepting surrender became an affirmation of humanity's capacity for mercy, even in its darkest hour. That is the lasting legacy of those desperate days in 1945, proof that even in total war's aftermath, the choice between mercy and revenge, between humanity and vengeance, could determine not just individual fates, but the future of nations and the judgment of history itself. By the spring of 1945, the once fearsome German Wehrmacht was broken, not just in strength but in spirit. For countless soldiers, surrendering to the Americans was not dishonor, it was salvation. To them, captivity meant a warm meal, a bed, and the faint hope of returning home one day. For many, it was the only way to escape the storm closing in from the east. The image of German troops lining up, eager to be taken prisoner, stands as one of the most striking symbols of a war that had finally consumed itself. In their desperation to surrender, they revealed the ultimate truth. Survival outweighed loyalty to a regime that had already fallen.